Hi guys, welcome to another session. It's been a while and finally back. So today's class we're going to be looking at an introduction to Fetch API. So API is actually a very broad lesson, right? But we're going to look at introduction to the Fetch API in today's class, and then subsequently we'll look at other um, ways we can use API and consume the data that we get from an API, right? So, first of all, without wasting too much of our time, let's get into the video. So, the Fetch API is a modern JavaScript interface for making network requests, primarily designed to replace the older XML HTTP request object. It provides a more promise-based and cleaner approach to fetching resources from the network, right? So what the Fetch API does is, so we have a server somewhere or a backend logic somewhere where we can access data from that backend on our front end, right? So the backend engineer will already design a product. For example, let's say a shopping cart, a shopping uh, an inventory, for example, where you have different items on the database. So with Fetch API, you can fetch those items that are in the database and present them on the client side of your website so that your user can see them. So that's what Fetch API is basically all about, right? Fetching data from a database or from a backend or from an API, right? So from the network. So this uses network. So what we do is we make HTTP requests and we handle responses. So whenever we make the request, we handle whatever responses we want to give. So basic usage of the Fetch API. The core of the Fetch API is the fetch. So there is a keyword called fetch function which takes a URL as its mandatory argument. So we can come and see our example here, right? So we have the fetch API together that takes in a URL. So um, let's see a practical example of this. We've already done something like that on our code base. So you can see that we are fetching from a URL. Now this URL is very active. This is an API. So if we should go to this page, we can see what that is. Swappy.dev. Blah blah blah. So this is the API, right? Let me go to the home page. So here's the home page. So you can see that we have some numbers here. We're going to take note of all of these details. By default, this is what the API does. So from your front end logic, you can decide to go to people. If you go then slash, then the number, that is the ID of what the person represents in the database, right? So we are looking for people, and we are inside of people. We are looking at ID number 3. So when we request this, it's going to present it in this format, and we're going to understand what this format is. This is called a JSON, right? The way this is structured is called JSON. So if you have the opportunity, please try and read about JSON. Because of the scope of this lesson, we'll not be talking about that. So you can read about JSON and get more clarification. JavaScript object notifier. I think that's what JSON means. So when we hit on the request, you notice that the name will change. So many other information will change because we are now fetching data from the database. That's what this front end is about. So when we say request, you'll see that the name has been changed. So arrow2d2 is stored with the ID number of 3. So if we change this to like 30 and we do the same request, we should have a different name here. So this is the same thing we want to do in our code base, right? And what we do is just to copy this entire thing, but it's not possible. So first of all, I copy this one, right? And then I take it to my code base. Let me quickly do this again so we can be seeing it. So I will do fetch curly bracket, then I paste that I copied. First of all, my quotes, single or double quotes. Then where do we want to go to? We want to go to people slash the number of, let's say, 34, and then we close that slash. So how the fetch API does is once we fetch the data, right, this data is now available to us, but we now have to make some responses, to write some responses. What do we want to do with this data, right? So that's where we have our .then, right? So we say .then, and the then is equal to a response, and we are converting that response to a JSON, right? So remember, you have to read about JSON to understand what JSON really is. So the next thing we want to do is, after we've converted that data to JSON, because JavaScript will not just understand what it is if it's not converted or compressed or stored as a JSON file, right? So we then do .then again, and what do we want to do with that data? So we say data, that is whatever we get from that, equal to, we do a simple arrow function. It can be any function, right? And we can say console.log data.name. So the question you'll be asking is, where is this .name coming from? So we are console logging this data .name, because what we've done is we fetched the data, we fetched this API, and we stored whatever information that we get from there in this data, right? This variable called data. So when we say data, we can access different objects in that. We can access name, we can access height, we can access mass, we can access different things here. So let's try and access the height. We say Control C. So we'll access the height, and we say height, right? So let's also get the error message. In case we have error, let's catch that, and we say console.log console.error. So first of all, let's comment this out. Let's comment it, all of them, and then we save it. And then when we come to our project and we right click on it and we inspect, if we go to our console, we should see the height. So on console, we should see the height. So this is the height here, right? So we can also make this very unique, that when we click on this button, it should not perform the function. So what we do is we'll bundle all of these things to an event listener, and we've already done that using this. Let me explain the code line by line, right? Then I'm going to comment this out. So what we did is we create a switch number, a variable called switch number, and mat.seal. Uh, so what this does is we look for random numbers. This is a function, an inbuilt function in JavaScript for random, to get random numbers. So every time we click on the button, every time the page reloads, what the function does is it changes the number, right? So switch number can be 1 now, and then the next time the page will reload, switch number becomes like 5 or 10 or 100, as the case may be. but at this point we are limiting it to 82. So what he's doing is he's starting from 1 to 82. So within the range, that's where he's picking the numbers from. So this is how to get random numbers. So we do math.ceil, math.random multiplied by the maximum number there. So the next thing we want to do is to call our function, our button, right? So we created a simple HTML file, and here's the button called switch. The ID of the button is switch, right? So what happens is once we click on this switch, we want to console log. That is what we have here, right? Once we click on the switch, we want to console log name. So when we click on switch, we've changed this thing now. It's no longer 1. It used to be 1 or 30 or the number there, but we are using a different method to solve that. I'm going to explain this in the live session, but the whole idea is just for us to see how the fetch API would work. So I believe we understand the other part of this code, because this is just a repetition of what we did here, right? So the only thing that is new here is we adding a event listener to the button. So we first of all selected the button right here, and then we add event listener to the button. So we're saying whenever the button is clicked, fetch the data, and with a random number being included inside of this place, and then console log the name. So when we save this, if everything is working perfectly, when we click on this button, let's hold on and see the magic, right? Boom. So whenever we click on the button, it gives us this. But we're going to notice something. We click on it again, we're getting the same name. So that's because the page did not reload, right? But when we refresh the page and we click on that button again, it's going to give us a different name. If we refresh the page again and we click on it, it will give us a different name. So that's exactly what we're doing there. So the next thing we want to do is, if you come to our HTML, you can see that we have different divs here, right? Instead of divs, let me try and put them in H1. Let's say H1, and then we put all of these in our H1. So you can correct the rest. You can either use H1 or whatever heading tag you want to use. So in this case, we've done this. So I want the name of the Star Wars character to be inside of here, but I want to do that in JavaScript, right? So that when the button is clicked, it adds that name there. And that's what we're going to do now. So this will no longer console log this. Rather, what we're going to do is, first of all, let's select the element that we want to update, which is this. We want to update the name, right? So we'll come over here and I'm going to give it I'm going to call a variable const, and let's say star name. Let's say star name equal to document, because we are selecting that, we're targeting the document there, dot, and we want to use the ID. So we get elements by ID, and then what's the ID? The ID is name. Let's come and check. So the ID is name. So after getting that, the next thing we want to do is to come over to where we did console log. So this was where we did console log, and this time around we don't want to do console log. Rather, we call that name. So star name dot inner text. So we're going to use inner text for this because we want to add a text, and equal to data dot name, because we want to add the name to that data. So when we save and we come over to here, and if we click on this, so the name should appear somewhere here, right? You can see the name. Let's click on it again and see. Okay, so it keeps giving that name. Maybe in the next lesson we're going to see how we can, whenever we click on this, we should refresh the page so that the name changes, so we get random names, right? So that's it for the today's class, and I hope to see you in the next class.